Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. It's available on Pacifica Radio Network and Progressive Radio Network and Stitcher and iTunes and SoundCloud. The complete archives are available at opednews.com/podcasts. And I am thrilled to have back as a repeat guest, Chuck Collins. He is the director of the program on inequality at the Institute for Policy Studies. And he's the author of the new book, The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Billions. And his websites are inequality.org and wealthhoarders.com for the book. Great to have you back.
Thanks for having me, Rob. And thanks for all the work you've done over the decades to draw attention to these issues and make it more of a mainstream conversation.
Well, we got it needs it so desperately, and it's such an important issue, and I am so glad and appreciate so much the depth of energy and intensity that you put into working on it, because you're really making a difference. And you know, it's hard not to start an interview with you without doing the Oscar Mayer story. So we should throw in a little bit about that. And in your book, you've got an interesting angle on it that was fresh to me. So you were in line to inherit a lot of money as one of the people in line for the Oscar Mayer fortune.
Yep, that was Oscar Mayer. Was my great grandfather. Founded a butcher shop in South Chicago or West End, and grew over multiple generations. It's true. I was fortunate to be born on third base, and but at a certain point, I started to see how creating sort of inherited wealth dynasties was kind of corrupting and undermining the other parts of a healthy society. And I just didn't really want to benefit from a system where some people inherited so much money and others had nothing to show. And it's relevant for this book because it gave me a window into how, the trusted advisors, the sort of professionals that work with wealthy families play such an important role in creating that culture of accumulation and dynasty. And so that was what got me interested in this topic.
So, okay. So the thing that I get out of this book, The Wealth Hoarders, is that there are wealth defenders. There's a wealth defense industry. And I can't on the radio use the language I want to describe these MFs. I mean, and you get into it a little bit. You talk about, I mean, you gave a talk at the Harvard, what was it, Harvard Business School?
Oh, well, that's actually, it is based on a talk I gave in the book. It's my mock commencement address to the Harvard Business School of 2021. Although I've given a similar talk, but it wasn't to the whole commencement. But the idea was to say, look, don't work for the billionaires. Your whole lives are in front of you. Don't spend this one precious life that you have helping the already rich get richer. There's so much more meaningful work to do out there. And I've had that conversation with lots of young people who are well positioned to work in finance and work in philanthropy, and to say, don't do it.
Yeah, and I think, to get into it, don't sell your soul to make filthy rich, disgusting people. Most of them are. There's an old Greek saying that there's no rich person that doesn't have a crime behind them.
Right. Yeah. Balzac said something similar. The behind every great fortune is a crime.
Maybe it was Balzac.
And yeah, but I like that because I think, some of the crimes are way more obvious, if you're the Sackler family right now and you've made your money off of peddling opioids and the opioid crisis. But yeah, the wealthy people themselves are responsible, but they also spend a lot of resources hiring these wealth defenders, and these are the tax lawyers and estate planners, people who work for family offices, which is when wealthy people kind of almost create an entire office to manage their finances. These folks get up every day and go to work, and their mission is to help the richest people in the world get richer and pass it on to their children undiminished. And so they're inherently in the business of avoiding taxes and avoiding responsibility if there are lawsuits or other things. And they're in the business of building dynasties, multi-generational inherited wealth dynasties, which are directly in conflict with having healthy democratic societies.
And you basically had a conversation with this one woman that you talk about in the book about this family office. And it ends up there are thousands of these family offices, each one dedicated to protecting and maintaining the wealth and building it. And she tried to talk you out of your idea of letting go of your money. How much did you let go of?
Well, at the time in 1986, it was about $500,000. So if that had stayed in the stock market, it would be, whatever, 6-7 million today. But the point you're making is really interesting, which is, a cardinal rule within wealthy families is you can be kind of quirky when it comes to income, but don't touch the assets, don't touch the corpus of the wealth, pass that on undiminished to the next generation. And this woman was kind of old Boston wealth, multi-generational old Boston Brahmin wealth. And, I had stood up and said something like, well, I'm thinking of giving away these assets. And she was trying to talk sense into me. And so she invited me to come see her family office. And I was like, well, what's a family office? And she's like, oh, well, this is our private financial trust company, basically, that manages the wealth of our family, and prepares the next generation to receive it. And I'm like, really? How many of these are there? And in the early 1980s, maybe there were 1,000 around the world. Now there are 10,000 family offices. And you need to probably have about $250 million in wealth for it to be worthwhile to have one of these offices where you bring all your services in-house. So it totally reflects this grotesque updraft of wealth into the hands of a few, that there are so many people who have these family offices now.
Now, in our previous conversations, we've talked about, I've been writing since about 2011, 2012, that we need to de-billionaireize the planet, that we got to make it illegal to be a billionaire. And what you've done in this book really is you've gotten into the details of what's involved in being really wealthy, and how there is this whole army of people who help to keep the wealthy wealthy. And I want to know how to find them on the street so I can tell them what contempt I have for them, because they are really monsters. And, my guess is most of them don't think that way at all. They think, oh, I'm a lawyer. I'm doing a good job. I'm helping to protect my client. I'm an accountant. I'm going to do everything I can to keep my client from paying taxes. And you know what? I don't want to pay a lot of taxes either. I go to the accountant and I have him do what he can so I don't have to pay as many taxes. But I don't get all these breaks. There are no special rules written for me or people in my class.
Yeah, most of us have our taxes taken out of our paycheck every pay period. We have withholding. There's not a lot of games that most people can play with their incomes and taxes. And that's where this group, this elite group, there's really a separate set of tax rules for the super rich. There are more ways they can move it around. And then you have these people who design, tax dodges. They design trusts. They have all the relationships you need to move money around the world, to detach it from nation states and from individuals. Their job, the wealth defense industry, is to make the richest people on the planet look like they don't have that much money on paper. And you said a couple of really important things. One is that they'll say, well, everything we do is legal. That's one of the justifications for that you'll hear from these wealth defense industry folks. But what I show in this book is they use they're writing the rules. They're lobbying to fend off oversight. They're creating the tax dodges and bogus business transactions. They're creating the system. They're writing the rules. They're writing the laws. So you can't just say, well, I'm just obeying the laws, when in fact you're writing the laws. You're taking advantage of weak nation states and weak US states, South Dakota, Delaware, whatever, to have your way. The other thing they'll say is, well, I'm just helping families. We're just helping these families and these family businesses. Well, as Brooke Harrington says, you're helping the richest families in the world, this tiny slice of people, at the expense of all the other families in the world. So yeah, you want to find these folks because they are part of the trust and estate section of the American Bar Association, and they are Society for Trust and Estate Planners. That's a certificate that people get to work in this field. They are well-paid professionals. As I say, they're paid millions to hide trillions.
So how do we out these people? How do we make it so that it is a shameful thing to do what they're doing? How do we make it clear to them that we know what they are, we know what they do, and they got to stop doing it, because it is worse than being a prostitute, worse than selling drugs, really. I mean,
Yeah.
the family that sold had the opiate business has killed thousands and thousands of people, literally killed them. And these aides, these people who help these billionaires and the ultra wealthy, which I think you count as over $30 million, they're enabling economically declarations of war on billions of people.
Yeah. They're enabling the plunder of the wealth of the commons, the wealth of workers. What's one thing, Rob, that I find interesting is, so part of what I've learned, how much I learned about this, is from talking to disaffected people who worked in the wealth defense industry. They were lawyers who worked there, and they just got soured to this. And one of the cracks in the system is that there are people waking up to what you're saying. They're waking up and going, I'm doing this job that's harming people, and they want out. And some of them are whistleblowers. They leak. The reason we know a lot of what we know about this hidden wealth system is because one disgruntled wealth defense worker at a law firm in Panama leaked tens of thousands of documents, became the Panama Papers. Someone inside a bank in Bermuda leaked thousands of documents about how the bank was creating, shell accounts. A number of Swiss bankers blew the whistle on all the money that was being hidden in Swiss bank accounts, and that led to reform. The Panama Papers brought down governments. The Prime Minister of England, the Prime Minister of Iceland were all implicated. So part of our job is to say, hey, if you work in this field, not only are you doing harm, but you can do good. You can come over and shine the light on this. You can blow the whistle on the system. You can tell us how it works. You can help Senator Sanders rewrite his estate tax bill to shut down the hidden wealth system. That's what one of these people did. They said, okay, I'm going to help lawmakers close up these loopholes, close up these holes. So part of the putting the pressure on these folks is to say, we're watching what you're doing, and we're going to hold you accountable for this, and you should come over to the other side.
Okay, so I've had a decent amount of experience with whistleblowers. I've spoken at many meetings. I've had a lot of them as guests on my show, gotten to be friends with them. Whistleblowers become whistleblowers when they get disgusted and there's no solutions within the system. And then when they blow the whistle, it often destroys their lives. That Panama whistleblower, what happened to that person?
Their identity was never revealed.
That's a smart thing to do.
So John Doe lives on.
That's good. So, if you're a listener now and you're hearing this, it may very well be that you know somebody, or you're related to somebody, or married to somebody, or you are the person who helps the ultra wealthy keep from paying the taxes that they should be paying. helps the ultra wealthy hide their money. And you get in the book into a lot of different ways that we might not think about, that money is hidden. And so when you're listening to this and you're hearing this, start thinking about the people you know who just might be doing that, and talk to them and challenge them and ask them, are you helping these rich people to avoid paying taxes that everybody else has to pay? Are you helping them to hide their money away? You know, when does hiding money become something immoral or illegal? I mean, and for what I'm hearing from you is they're not breaking the laws because they made the laws. They hired the lobbyists and they funded the politicians, so they don't have to worry about the laws. They've got them all covered. But that doesn't mean what they're doing is right. It doesn't mean that it's not horrible, that it's not disgusting and despicable.
And some of it is illegal, or it certainly undermines the intent of the law. You know, a lot of these tax loopholes, they create fictional transactions. You know, you create a shell company A and shell company B, and you're sending money back and forth. You're making it look like there's some legitimate business activity when there isn't. But I think, you know, for your listeners, for all of us, thinking about people, there are people walking around among us who say, yeah, I work, I'm a wealth manager, or I work in the trust division of such and such a bank. And I think it's good to just say, well, so are you helping billionaires hide their money? Are you part of the system of wealth hiding that causes harms? And let's be clear what the harms are. If the rich aren't paying their fair share, then they're passing the bill to the rest of us. Or they're passing budget cuts to the rest of us. They're enabling the plundering of countries around the world. There's all these countries in the global south where their wealthy elites steal money from their own people, and they take it out of the country, and they use this system of shell companies and offshore tax havens, but they often bring it here to the United States.
And you say in your book that the U.S. is one of the biggest tax havens in the world.
Yeah, partly because the European Union countries are starting to clean up their act. They're starting to require banks to disclose more information. They're starting to require corporations to say who their real owners are. And all of a sudden, the US has become the weak link. We're the laggards. We are less transparent. So these billionaires, if you're a Russian oligarch, you're a Chinese billionaire, and you've just, you want to get your money out of China, you're some dictator, you've stolen money from your own people, where do you park it? Well, right now, bringing it to the US is a very attractive destination, and it's showing up in our luxury real estate markets, and it's showing up buying land, and it's showing up buying art. And it's often anonymous shell companies, but that could be criminal money that's been stolen from other countries. And it's here down the street in some luxury apartment building. So the US has become a destination for illicit funds.
So you give some examples of some really horrible people who had a lot of money. And the examples you gave basically showed their lack of accountability, how it was impossible really to hold them accountable for what they did. There you had the blue Hippo story with Joseph Rensin, is it? And then Isabel de Santos, of the daughter of the dictator of Angola. And talk a little bit about the two of them and where they fit into this picture.
Yeah, I think it's, part of what's happening is it isn't just about tax avoidance. It's also about escaping accountability for your actions. So in the case of Joseph Rensin, here's a guy who started a company called Blue Hippo. He sold computers with late night television ads. Imagine you're watching television at 1 a.m. and up comes this ad and it has this cartoon Blue Hippo. You can buy a computer for, $40 a week. You can do a layaway and you'll get this computer sent to you. And so you call the 800 number, you give them your bank account number. Every week, $40 starts to come out. And then at some point you're like, well, hey, where's that computer? And that computer never comes. It's a complete scam. So this guy, his company, was scamming mostly people in Maryland for several years. Finally, the Federal Trade Commission came after the company. The company went bankrupt. They started to go after Rensin himself, and he had gone to these lawyers in Florida and created these offshore asset protection trusts in the Cook's Islands, which are somewhere east of New Zealand. And oh, by the way, if you want to challenge a trust in the Cook Islands, you have to go there. Like they've created a whole system for deadbeats, like this guy Rensin. He creates a homestead trust in Florida. So here's a guy, he's swindled millions of dollars from people, and he's living in a house, a mansion. He's got a Lamborghini. He's got a Facebook. He's putting puppy pictures on his Facebook account. I mean, he's walking free. Somebody who steals a pack of gum and tries to change a $20 bill, is arrested or worse, in our country. But people like this walk free. Why? Because this wealth defense industry helped him ship the money and play global shell games with it.
So even though he was found guilty of fraud, he never was accountable. None of the people ever got their money back, and he defrauded tens of thousands of people.
And these were working people. These were low-income working people who I think part of their pitch was, you have damaged credit, we'll still sell you a computer, right? Imagine, and I read the consumer fraud bulletin board, where people would just write their stories. It was heartbreaking. You're thinking, how is it possible this person isn't in jail? But he's not. That's because of this wealth defense system.
So you got the Cook Islands have a system set up. Why aren't we doing something about? Why doesn't the United States? Why doesn't the United States with Australia and New Zealand do something about those islands? Like they treat them like economic terrorists, because that's really what they are in a sense. I mean, is that going too far to say that?
No, and in fact, I think part of what holds back the U.S. is a lot of this activity has come onshore now. We have asset protection trusts in Alaska. We have Dynasty trusts in South Dakota. We haven't cleaned up our own house, let alone used our global clout to change this. My view is this is fixable. More money for enforcement, and we should talk about this because President Biden has just put forward a bold proposal to spend money on enforcement. But enforce, require transparency, shut down some of these loopholes and trusts. Once we start to clean up our own act, then we go to England. Between England and the US, many of these tax haven countries are part of the English-speaking Commonwealth. They are Belize and British Virgin Islands and the Cook Islands, and some of them are still under the British Chancery legal system, So don't believe for a minute that if we start to lean on those countries and tell them to clean up their act, or they're going to be economic pariahs, they're not going to fall into line. It's only a couple hundred wealth defense people who benefit in those countries from this whole system. So there's a pathway to shutting it down, and it goes right through the US and the UK for starters.
Okay, so we're going to take a brief show ID, and then we're going to come back and talk about Biden's money and about how to deal with these British entities, really. And my guest for the show is Chuck Collins. He's the director of the program on inequality at the Institute for Policy Studies, and he's the author of the new book, The Wealth Hoarders: How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Billions. So Joe Biden just came out in the last couple of days with an idea of coming up with $80 billion to fund IRS. Now, why is that needed, and why is that so important?
Well, part of what the wealth defense industry has done so well is fend off oversight. And, they've teamed up with the sort of shrink government wing of the Republican Party to gut the IRS as an oversight agency. And they've demonized the IRS, and they've, they've 18,000 people who used to work there are gone. And what's happened is they've lost the part of the IRS, the expertise to follow the money, follow the rich and all their sort of antics. So they're no longer auditing the rich. In fact, if you use the earned income credit, you're 4 times more likely to get audited than if you're some, billionaire. So
And the
they've
earned income credit is something that middle class people.
yeah, low and working class folks use the earned income credit. So, that just goes to show how sort of misplaced the priorities are. And actually Biden is right on target. He's saying, look, we're going to spend 80 billion over the next 10 years. We're going to rebuild the capacity of the IRS to follow the money, track these legal shenanigans, these illegal games, and close them down. And for every dollar they invest, they're going to bring in tens of dollars of revenue. So it's a good investment, if nothing else, in enforcement. In fact, the commissioner of the IRS a couple of weeks ago was asked, "What's the tax gap? What's the gap between what the IRS should be raising and what they are raising due to avoidance and lack of enforcement?" He says it's $1 trillion. And the chairman of the committee says, no, over 10 years, $10 trillion? No, every year, $1 trillion. The rich are escaping $1 trillion of taxes. So that should get us really mad because first, none of us, as you said, none of us like the IRS. The IRS is harassing, low-income working people are harassing us over, our taxes on our unemployment benefits right now. That's like, meanwhile, the richest 1/10 of 1% is mocking us. Even the Trump Treasury, secretary says, the estate tax, only morons pay the estate tax. Like only the little people pay this. Like that's their attitude. So the fact that Biden is going to invest in enforcement along with other things to raise taxes on the rich is exactly the right way to go, and it won't work unless they shut down this hidden wealth system.
So in the book, you go through the cost of hidden wealth, how it affects us, how it affects each of us. How does that work? How does a billionaire's wealth affect you and I?
Well, the fact that they're not paying means that you are paying. Here we are in this COVID pandemic where we've had all these emergency COVID relief bills, trillions and trillions of dollars. At some point, we're going to have to figure out how to pay for them. Should working class folks, people who've been frontline essential workers, now pay higher taxes at this moment to cover that? That would be counterproductive. What about the people who've seen their wealth surge during the pandemic? I mean, you and I have talked about this, Rob, but in the last 13 months, the billionaire class in the US has seen their wealth go up $1.6 trillion. The entire wealth of the billionaire class since 1990 has gone up. A third of the increase has just been in the last 13 months. So those are the folks that should be paying more taxes right now. The next $10 trillion of revenue, from my perspective, should come from these global companies who've been dodging taxes and the super rich. So that's one reason it matters to us, is like ordinary people shouldn't be paying more. But the other is this system is entrenching inequality. It's keeping most people down. It's concentrating wealth at the top, and it's creating these kind of oligarchic wealth dynasties that are wrecking our democracy, creating volatility in the economy, undermining the quality of life for everybody. So it's part of the system that's worsening inequality.
And Trump passed that huge $1.52 trillion bill. That was all about cutting the dynasty tax, the inheritance tax, right?
Yeah, I mean the 2017 so-called Trump tax code cost $2 trillion. It's mostly gave tax breaks to the rich. It raised the exemptions on the wealth tax to, like, today it's like almost 12 million for an individual, 24 million for a couple. That's the level at which the tax begins to kick in. And they've made, these huge corporate tax cuts. Now we have, 55 giant global companies that we found 2019 paid no taxes. Nike, Archer Daniel Midlands, Zoom. These are companies paid, profitable companies paid no taxes because of the Trump tax cut.
It's obscene. It's Trump, as far as I'm concerned, is a psychopath who he's still operating in so many ways because of what he's done. Now, so it's 12 million for an individual, 24 million for a couple. That's an inheritance, right? So
That's how much you can pass on before the estate tax kicks in.
what should it be?
Well, actually, I think targeting at the very top is good. What I would say is starting maybe at 5 million, there should be some estate tax, but that the rate should get higher. And this is part of the Sanders estate tax reform. When you get to the $1 billion wealth level, then the rate should be as high as 70%. Or, maybe it should go higher. I mean, like your proposal would be like, you get over $1 billion, wealth above $1 billion should just be taxed away at 100% level.
It should
I mean,
be illegal.
yeah. So you have a progressive estate tax where you sort of hit this democracy distorting concentration of wealth level. We as a democratic society say that's enough. I mean, you and I have talked about this, but geez, like how much is enough? Right. I mean, to me, once somebody has $30 million, you've got enough to meet your needs and your wild desires. You've got enough for your children and probably your grandchildren. Above that level, it's about power. It's about concentrated power, the ability to shape the rules. That's when, as a society, we should be like, no, above certain levels, we're starting to tax at a progressive level. And then you hit that very high level, it's all about power at that point. It's about oligarchy. And in order to protect our democratic society, it should be taxed away.
And I really believe it. If somebody's got that much money, they didn't get it all honestly. And there are ways that they're doing it it may be that they're exploiting workers, like Jeff Bezos. Their workers have to bring a bottle to pee in because they don't get a break to pee. I mean, that's horrific as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. And I think that people are a little afraid of the idea of saying, oh, you've got $1 billion and you're going to have to pay taxes on anything over 5 million. Oh, come on, give them a break. I think back during Occupy, there was somebody who had a sign, and basically something along the lines that if you have the fantasy that you're going to be a billionaire, so you're protecting the billionaires because of your fantasy, you're a big part of the problem. I mean, how many people are like that? The fact is that you've dealt with very wealthy people. I know Bill Gates' father you worked with, who basically say that there ought to be taxes. There are wealthy people who see that the system is not working the way it should. Talk a little bit about them, because at least we know there are some people like that.
Yeah, I think it is important to say, that there are wealthy, there's this whole network called the Patriotic Millionaires that are out there lobbying for increased taxes on people like them, on themselves. One of the things that's really valuable about that is they get up and they say, look, yeah, I worked hard, but a lot of people work hard. I was in the right place at the right time. I didn't do it alone. I didn't create this wealth alone. And I benefit from all these public investments that society makes, and I should pay back so that others can have the same opportunities. And there's a number of people who could have been a lot more wealthy, but they chose to pay their workers more. They chose not to take every nickel and extract it from the company or the customers. Take Craig Newmark, who started Craigslist. He could have, he left billions of dollars on the table. He didn't monetize. He created a kind of a commons. You don't have, unless you're doing housing and landlord real rentals or whatever, you don't pay anything to have your ad listed on Craigslist. It's like a free exchange. He could have been charging us for whenever we're putting our, kitchen table that we're selling up on Craigslist, but he doesn't. He says it's better off if people have the money in their pockets,
And he's still a billionaire.
He's still wealthy, because this business model. But he could be a billionaire many times over. He could be like the intermediaries who created eBay. Why isn't Craigslist like eBay? Where you pay for every little slot that you have and everything you sell. So, I think we should say not everybody grabs the whole pile. And recognize they don't have to. So, I think there are people who understand you can't have a healthy society. You can't have a functioning democratic society if there's so much wealth and power in so few hands. And it's in their selfish interest to not keep becoming, like an apartheid society. So yeah, those people are important because they validate the views that someone like you's been saying for a long time, that this too much inequality is dangerous.
It's deadly. And like you've said, it's deadly to democracy. So Craig Newmark is a great guy. I've met him a couple times. I had him on my show, and he gives away a lot to help make democracy happen. And it's one of the reasons why I think that it might not necessarily be that if somehow a law could be passed saying it's illegal to be a billionaire, which I believe should happen, it wouldn't necessarily mean that people have to give away all their money. They might be able to put some of it into some kind of a acceptable place. But you get into the problem of philanthropy. What are the problems of philanthropy when we look at these wealthy people?
Well, in some ways, philanthropy is a taxpayer subsidized way that we give wealthy people, an extension of their power. So just to start with that, when a billionaire gives $1 to charity, you and I are chipping in 74 cents of that dollar in lost tax revenue, not just income tax, but that billionaire is reducing their inheritance estate taxes too. So look, that's the first point. We have to remember this is not, we're like joint partners in these ventures. Second, the richer the donors, the more often they put their charitable gifts in private foundations and donor advised funds that they continue to control. So they already took the tax break. Now they've created a private foundation that can exist in perpetuity. And some of them intend for them to exist in perpetuity. So wait a second here. How come we're subsidizing somebody's private giving account? And then the other troubling trend, Rob, is that giving by low and middle income people has been steadily going down for 2 decades, partly, I think, because rising economic insecurity. People don't feel like they have the cushion to be able to give money away. And most of the new giving, most of the growth in giving is coming from the rich. So that means that the rich are calling the shots now more and more in terms of what gets funded in the nonprofit sector. So that corrupts our nonprofit independent sector.
I would imagine that applies to foundations as well. If some millionaire gives $10 million to a foundation is accountable to that millionaire for how they spend that money.
Yeah, I mean that, a lot of the donor advised funds, they say, well, you gave to the donor advised fund, now you've given up your power. Well, that's not true. These are donor advised. The donor still is deciding where the money goes. And the problem with donor advised funds is they have no payout requirement. You can create a donor advised fund and then you can have it be your hobby investing fund for the next 20 years. So the money isn't leaving and going to the food bank or the recipient charity. It's staying warehoused in these intermediaries.
So this is not that different from some bank in the Caribbean where people are hiding their money.
I mean, technically they've given it away in that they can't just get it back and buy a car with it, right? They are given, eventually it's supposed to go to a qualified charitable recipient group.
They can give their niece or their nephew a $150,000 a year job, and then they can buy a car.
Exactly. I mean, that's one of the abuses of a private foundation. You're supposed to give away 5% a year, but you can give away, that includes your overhead. So you can hire your ne'er-do-well kids, give them jobs and even assistance, and you can have meetings in Caribbean resorts. I mean, there's unfortunately a bunch of abuses of that system it's not the majority, but there's enough cases where let the Conrad Hilton Foundation, right? Conrad Hilton, the hotel magnate, 8 Hilton family members sit on this board. They have 3 board meetings a year, and they're paid a stipend of $35,000 a year to just go to a board meeting. There's one couple family foundations that pay their family members $300,000 a year. Like, that is, again, so I think the most important thing to just say is philanthropy may do some things useful, but it's not a substitute for the rich paying their fair share of taxes and for public investments at the local, state, and federal level.
But it sounds to me like these philanthropic organizations, the way that they're structured and set up, should be thrown out entirely. It sounds like there is way too much opportunity to abuse the system, and it's part of what needs to go.
Yeah. And actually, we have a project called the Charity Reform Project, which is, our view is, the private, closely held family foundation should no longer exist. Just what you're saying. There should be no such thing. Taxpayers should not be subsidizing some private giving account in perpetuity that's only controlled by family. If you want to create a community foundation and have a broad-based community board of decision makers, that's different. That's broadly controlled. But this whole idea that you and me and our 2 kids are all going to sit down and make these decisions, that should just not be allowed. And there should be payout. There should be an absolute, the payout should be higher, and a gift of, giving above a certain threshold should no longer be tax deductible. Again, I would say $500 million, you can give that, create a foundation. That's the most that you can do. That anything above that, you have to pay taxes on that wealth. It's not a complete escape for. And you mentioned my relationship with Bill Gates' father, but he used to say, isn't it interesting? My son is going to give $100 billion to his foundation. That's wealth that Microsoft created that he will never pay taxes on. Isn't there something wrong with that? He used to just muse out loud.
Yeah. So you talk in the book, you have a section on hidden wealth hiding in our neighborhoods. What's that about?
Well, this goes to this problem of, you got $1 billion. Where do you park it? Where do you invest it? And part of what's going on is these billionaires, not only in the US, but globally, are bringing money to the United States, and they need to diversify where they put their money. So some of it's in the stock market, and some of it's in bonds, and some of it's in private equity over here. But in order to kind of hedge against changes in the financial markets, you're going to put some in land and some in housing. Well, that's a lot of wealth looking for parking places, if you will. And so that's driving this whole sector of luxury real estate. For those of us who live on the coasts and maybe a few places like Denver, there's this boom in luxury housing construction, not for people to live in, but essentially as sort of wealth storage units. Same with art, same with jewelry, same with every asset class. Cryptocurrencies are a new one. People are just spreading their money around, putting it in lots of places. But the problem with luxury real estate is it's disrupting our communities. It's driving up the cost of land. It's creating these like hollowed out communities where there's no one lives there, just a bunch of vacant units. Here our cities are reeling with affordable housing crises right now, and there's all these empty luxury units sitting there. So it comes with harms.
Okay. So you're optimistic. You're in this book, you are pretty optimistic. And I was really surprised. You talk near the end of the book about how there's some progress being made. And you talk about some of the plans of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. So let's wrap up this interview with a little hope, a little brief show ID, and then come back and give us some hope. And my guest for the show is Chuck Collins. He's the director of the program on inequality at the Institute for Policy Studies and is the author of the new book, The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Billions. His websites are inequality.org and wealthhoarders.com. So, Hope, what's going on that's good? And how do we keep it going? What do we do to turn this around when these are such powerful people? And
Yeah.
amazing there's anything good going on. So tell us about it.
Well, a couple of things that I think are on the good news front. One is, as I said, there are cracks in the system. There are people who used to work in the system who are stepping out of it, who are telling the secrets of the temple, who are educating the rest of us, who are talking to people like me who I can tell their stories. The other thing is this push toward enforcement. I mean, this week, President Biden pushing there's a movement pushing to strengthen the IRSs and the ability to oversee the shenanigans of the rich. That's a really important step. Something that happened at the end of last year that it's not in my book is Congress passed something called the Corporate Transparency Act. Trump signed it into law. It requires corporations to disclose who their beneficial owners are to the Treasury Department. There are some loopholes in that, like trusts and partnerships are not included, but it is a huge step in the right direction. And it had broad support from law enforcement, from Republicans who are concerned about what we're talking about in the real estate market, this hollowing out of the real estate market. So there's a whole movement for transparency. Third,
how would that work? Can you give an example what that would look like?
Yeah, for every property above a certain value has to register with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN. All cash transactions, the owners have to be disclosed. No more Delaware limited liability company. You have to say who it is. So that's not information you and I will get, but it's law enforcement. But there's also a movement in a lot of cities to say, look, you want to buy real estate in our city? You need to disclose who the beneficial owner of this property is. No more anonymous ownership of real estate. And local jurisdictions can do that. Los Angeles is exploring. You record your deed for your property. You have to say who the beneficial owner is. I call it the library card level of disclosure. You want to go to get a library card, Rob. You have to tell the librarian who you are, your real name, and where you live. Right now, it's harder to get a library card than it is to create one of these shell companies. You have to give less information, so that we can close that loophole. Third, really positive thing, I mentioned Senator Sanders has drafted and has introduced an estate tax reform bill that has a whole bunch of provisions that just shut down dynasty trusts, grantor retained annuity trusts, some of these sort of shenanigans. He basically has got help from these disaffected, disgruntled wealth defense professionals to write a bunch of provisions to shut down the loopholes.
We literally need to make dynasties non-existent. We've got to just completely shut them down. What does that involve? What would it take to shut down dynasties, to get rid of next generation sphincter? I'm not going to use the AH word. Young people who are born on third base and who don't do the principal thing like you.
Well, we have to do something at the federal level, because what's happening is a bunch of states have suspended what they call the rule against perpetuities, which limits how long trusts can exist. Traditional common law, there's a limit to how long you could create a trust. It eventually has to pay out. The funds have to move out of the trust. And a bunch of these states have changed the rules, so these trusts can exist forever.
What states?
South Dakota, Wyoming, Alaska. More and more states, unfortunately, are doing it, or
Red
partially.
states.
Sorry?
Red states.
Yeah, red states, where often small states where the legislature is captured by big money.
All right, so Delaware is a blue state that probably does the same thing.
Delaware has a whole industry around secrecy. They have a lot of selfish interest in their secret limited liability companies.
Now, in your book, you emphasize transparency. That's a big deal. I mean, and that's where whistleblowing comes into play again too. But is there more legislation happening for transparency in the U.S. or elsewhere?
There's more that we can do to get banks to disclose who account holders are, consultants, tax advisors, others should have to file what they call, if they suspect that there's criminal activity, banks right now have to file a suspicious activity report.
Yeah, but you say in the book that financial institutions don't have to do that. And they're probably the ones that are seeing most of the money.
Yeah, the non-bank, non-regulated one. Yeah, so expand the suspicious activity oversight to other players, accountants, lawyers. It's a little complicated with lawyers because of attorney-client privilege, but still, if your client is committing crimes, you should be, you're culpable.
Is a lawyer culpable if a client is committing crimes and and he's aware of it or she's aware of it?
Well, that's where this attorney-client privilege thing comes in, that people get to have legal defense even when they're criminals. So they don't technically have to they don't have to report. But if they suspect that somebody is engaged in criminal activity, they have some ethical responsibilities. I don't know all the particularities there, but I just know it's more complicated to say they have to be reporting criminal activity.
Well, since they're such an important part in this wealth defense ecosystem, I'm expecting something on that in your next book. Okay.
Yeah, we'll see what we can do. Yeah, the final good news is, hey, if the U.S. is, there are other countries that are waiting for us to step up at this point. Fed Chair Janet Yellen said recently, we should have a global corporate minimum income tax, a floor, so that countries aren't pitting, corporations aren't pitting countries against each other in a race to the bottom. That's exactly what we need to do, create kind of treaties and understandings, disclosure. Okay, what is Nike paying in Portugal? What is Nike paying in Germany? What is Nike paying in England? We have all that information so Nike can't game the system. That's the kind of international cooperation that both systems of transparency and country by country reporting on taxes. That'll all, if we do all that, we start to shut down this hidden wealth system in a meaningful way.
One of the scariest things you say, I'm going to read a little bit here. We're living in an increasingly globalized system with capital delinked from nation states. The transnational capitalist class, as sociologist William Robinson describes it, is altering the economic system. Within this evolving system, wealthy people and transnational companies are attempting to become stateless and unaccountable to national rules. They are also working to delink themselves from conventional forms of asset ownership. That sounds really scary.
Yeah.
Sounds really dangerous.
Yeah. It does, and I think it makes it feel even bigger and maybe unwieldier that it's a global system. But the reality is there are a couple of really important pressure points in that global system. One of them being the United States, the other being England. You get huge pressure points on those pieces of the system. It starts to crack and unravel. That's I think the way forward in my mind.
And you have on page 151 and 154 a whole bunch of very specific items on how to do things. Transparency against money laundering, corporate taxation and governance, disclosure of beneficial ownership of real estate. And you get into details on each one of these. I mean, have you given a copy of this book to each member of Congress?
Not yet. I'll take a box around the give them out. But there are the timing of this book is quite good in that this is really on people's minds right now. They're really trying to figure out, if you want to restore any kind of progressivity in the federal tax system, we have to deal with this hidden wealth system. So people are having a more rigorous discussion. What would it take And one thing I love is, look, cities are having a conversation. We're just getting hammered by global capital touching down and disrupting our communities. We should at least be taxing it. We should at least know who the players are. So luxury transfer taxes, municipal disclosure, anti-vacancy laws. You're going to leave a unit vacant for a year, you have to pay a higher property tax. There's things cities can do to protect themselves from these forces and actually maybe capture some revenue for affordable housing. So that's got people's imaginations.
Now, I've been involved, and I know you're aware of it, the public banking movement, and there's efforts to make that happen. Here in Philadelphia, for example, they're pretty far along on it, and there are other places as well. It seems to me that it takes an organization of people advocating for it, working towards it. I mean, there are a whole bunch of people in Philly who are parts of the public banking movement who have for years been meeting and working and attempting to influence politicians. It seems like there needs to be a similar kind of an organizational effort with what you're talking about. Is there?
Yeah, there is a national coalition called the FACT Coalition, Financial Accountability, Corporate Transparency, that's really worked to pass that Corporate Transparency Act. But the way I see it, Rob, is this is the perfect complement to the public banking, meaning that public banking is building a healthy new part of the ecosystem. But you have to shut down the harmful part of the ecosystem, which is this hidden wealth extractive system. And they really are two sides of the same coin. How do you create a democratic financial system? You got to stop the bad and build up the good.
And
that's
this goes back. This goes back to the time of the feudal system. This goes back to when there were lords and kings, and most people weren't allowed to have money. Most people weren't even allowed to take care of themselves. They had to literally live indentured or almost in slave-like lives, where they had to come up with enough farming to take care of their lords. And we're not that far from that, really.
Yeah, no, in a way, I say the billionaires are trying to re-feudalize. I mean, we never had feudalism in the United States, but when you start to eliminate the rules governing trusts and, allow for these oligarchic concentrations of wealth and power, and then you, at the same time, disenfranchise millions of people from having any kind of wealth and power, you're essentially re-feudalizing society. You're bringing feudalism back to our societies.
And it's not like, and we did have indentured servitude here. We did have that. Okay, we've got to wrap. Final words?
Well, thank you for, as always, having a great conversation. And yeah, I hope people will read the book and join the public banking movement and the movement against predatory finance. And, check out inequality.org, where you can see, weekly updates. We have a newsletter that goes out every week where we talk about what are the campaigns and things that people are doing together to address these problems. So join the movement at inequality.org and let's work together to build a healthy financial system and stop feudalism in America.
And my guest for this show has been Chuck Collins, the director of the program on inequality at the Institute for Policy Studies and the author of the new book, The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Billions. Websites, inequality.org and wealthhoarders.com. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Rob.